And actually now I'm absolutely delighted to move forward with our panel discussion. So pleased to be joined by Monique Carter, who is the People and Organization Director at Anglo American. Monique wears a number of different hats, and she's also on the steering group for the FTSE Women Leaders Review. And we're absolutely delighted to have her input in relation to the current review, particularly representing the mining sector, which is super. Also delighted to welcome Chris Macrae, who's the head of workforce strategy at Rio Tinto. And we've seen that they have an incredibly strong showing in terms of the FTSE Women Leaders Review as well. And then we're thrilled to have Santiago Montt, who is the CEO of Los Andes Copper and president of Minera Vizcachitas. I hope I got that pronunciation right, who is joining us for our discussion today. So we have a CEO and then head of workforce strategy and a chief people officer joining us from the mining sector. And Santiago is actually based in Chile. So he's dialing in from a long way away today. Thank goodness we've got Zoom. Otherwise, I have to take the long trip. So super. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on this webinar today. And I'd like to start with an open question to each of you. And Chris, I'm going to come to you first. So you've heard the progress that's been made in relation to gender balance in the mining sector. And actually, it's been hugely impressive because we often hear, oh, certain sectors, they're so difficult to make progress on. Look at the history, look at how we operate, look at the sort of talent we attract, look at where we operate and the tough conditions in which we operate. We couldn't possibly be making this level of progress. And actually, it's really impressive to see what the mining sector has done. But Chris, I'd just love to get some initial impressions from you, and then I'm going to ask each of my other panelists, is what stands out most from the data that I've shared today in terms of boards and leadership for the mining sector? And were there any specific milestones or moments in your organizations that were a turning point in relation to gender diversity at the board and executive level?
Yeah, thank you so much, Vivienne, and it's fantastic to be with you all today. I think the thing that really stands out for me was when you showed some of the charts and we showed that sort of steady progress over time. And that really stands out to me because I think, this is a long-term game if we're going to make sustainable change. And you can move the needle on certain populations sometimes quite quickly, but the question is whether that's sustainable and whether then in a few years' time you dip back down again. So that really stood out for me, and I think that's where actually seeing the data and being able to, particularly once you brought in the sector specific focus for mining, it is difficult, but actually having the data and seeing that other organizations are making progress is a really important lever in terms of overcoming that it's too difficult conversation that you can encounter in different parts of the business. So I think that's been incredibly helpful. I think and a couple of other things in terms of milestones for me. Data will go up and down. You will have peaks and troughs. So, we show in the most recent report as having made the most progress as boards. That's actually because of a moment in time that when the data was taken the year before, we had a couple of board directors step down at the end of the year, and our new board directors didn't take up their position until into the new year. And so you do have to, again, really understand the story and not take a moment in time data, but also to understand, and we see that a lot with pipelines, and I may talk to it later, that you build a pipeline and then you utilize that pipeline, and it may mean that then you don't have any more women who are ready now to step up for a period of time, and so progression won't be consistent. I think a couple of milestones for us. So I would say the biggest one was probably last year, so quite recent. Our representation of women on Exco is now 45%, which is great. But I think most importantly, we now have 2 of our 4 product group CEOs. So our CEO for copper and our CEO for minerals are women. So I think having that gender balance in our big operational roles rather than necessarily in the functional roles or the other areas was a real breakthrough for us. Now, we're not yet there in terms of at the layer below that we don't have gender parity there, but I think getting it there was really important, both in terms of those women now impacting the culture in our big operations to hopefully make that culture more inclusive and enable us to bring more women through, but also to really provide some hugely visible role models, not just within Rio, but to women more broadly looking at the mining sector. So I would call on that one.
Oh, that's super, really helpful. Thank you. And I agree with you. Some of those snapshots can not necessarily give the full picture. I think that's one of the terrific things about when you've been consistently measuring the same data points over a long period of time, then you can see the trends in the movement. And that's really what's most important, because things do go up and down. And I also take your point about, you know, at some points you have a more of an opportunity to deliver change. So if you have a significant turnover in relation to the boards, than at other times. So at other times, it's just not possible for a period of time to make that change unless something out of your control happens. So you have to take the opportunity when it arises in order to realize the change. So the progress is never going to be consistent. Thank you so much. Santiago, I'd love to hear from you as well. I mean, this report is UK focused, but it'd be really helpful to get that broader global piece because all of your organizations operate in a global way and have global impact.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Let me start saying that my position here in the panel is a little bit different. I work in a junior company, so I work in a very small company. I worked though at VHP for 11 years. I left as the VP of Corporate Affairs for the Americas. But I'm Chilean and I live in Chile and I work in Chile, and Chile is a mining jurisdiction. So I'm gonna speak probably like more of a jurisdiction, and your presentation was very, very enlightening in making me go to Chile and look at the data and sharing some of the data, given that Chile again is a mining jurisdiction. And it's really, really impressive what the UK has done. When I look now in Chile, and the data is not that disaggregated in Chile, unfortunately, but women in general have moved from 8% in the mining industry to 21.8%, which is quite impressive as well. Now, when we look at the data of companies that report to the financial regulator, which is a universe of 500 today, we have moved in board representation from 13% in 2021 to 24% in 2024. So it's still a significant progress. So even though we're behind, first stand out that the UK and some other European countries also represent a very strong influence and model to follow. It really impressed me also in Chile, something that you mentioned, Vivienne, as well, which is this public-private partnership approach to the problem. Here in Chile, there has been a lot of efforts, combined efforts, in which the government is working with companies and NGOs. And let me give you two examples. One is the workforce mining and women that was created by the current Minister of Mining in her previous administration in 2014. And that has been very, very important in mining. And I want to thank the Ministry of Mining for providing me with that as well. The other is another effort that is being done by the Ministry of Finance together with a foundation which is called Chile Mujer, women in Chilean women. Super powerful report together with the financial regulator that shows all the data. So again, this combined effort. At the same time, Chile now is passing a new law, probably will pass this year in Congress, which will move more to the quota model, the European quota model, but still under a soft approach for the first period. Also, This was included, women and female participation was included in the mining policy, in the 2050 mining policy, in which certain targets were set there. So again, a very strong efforts from all sides. Of course, also to mention women in mining Chile, that has been a very important contributing force in pushing this in the public agenda. So that's a first view of Chile. Thank you.
That's really fascinating. Thank you so much, and intriguing to hear that you're going to be moving toward, soft quotas initially, but actually that concerted effort, setting effectively a target, an ambition for companies to aim toward in Chile. So thank you so much. Monique, I'd be interested in your perspective as well, especially operating from a huge company like Anglo American.
Thanks, Vivienne. Yeah, I mean, my reflections are that, the mining sector has made significant progress over the last 15 years. I think, we've gone from some isolated efforts to more systemic change. And I think the progress is really good, but it's a journey. I think, having the data is really critical. And, all of the companies that I've worked for in the past, what gets measured gets done. So there is a real benefit in having the approach that we have, certainly in the UK, with FTSE women leaders. But of course, I would say that, wouldn't I, Vivienne? But I can say that before I joined Anglo American 2 years ago, I worked for a Danish company, Novo Nordisk, and in terms of the discussions with the executive committee, it was very much seen as the role model, setting the standard for how to have the right conversations and make the progress in terms of gender representation in leadership, looking at what the FTSE women leaders were doing, and of course Hampton Alexander before that. So I think yes, there are some issues in terms of perceptions about the mining industry, but actually I also worked in automotive previously, so when I see your bar chart with automotive and parts on one end, and I think healthcare somewhere in the middle between natural resources and automotive, I think based on personal experience, the challenges are the same across the board. We've made really great progress on women in leadership, but I think Chris mentioned it, we need to focus on the pipeline, because you need to have a sustainable pool of capable people to fill the roles, and sometimes you can plan for that, sometimes it's unexpected, but if you don't have a pool, then you've got a problem. So I think again, it's a journey, and we're on it.
That's super, thank you. And a really important point you make there around perception. There's lots of perceptions and opinions about the representation, about what the issues are, and so on and so forth. But actually, there's nothing quite like looking at the data that can dispel the myths. So, one of the data points is that although companies have made huge progress in relation to women on boards in the UK, 6 out of 10 board roles still go to men. So it hasn't reached parity yet. So even though there may be a perception that perhaps we've gone far enough or have done enough, actually, when we look at the data, that's actually where we find the information. And so that's absolutely important. If I could come back to you, Santiago, and just have to ask you a little bit about barriers and challenges. Could you talk to us a little bit about what you see as being the most significant barriers and challenges in companies that you've worked in terms of advancing women's representation at the boards and leadership levels?
Thank you. Yes, look, I'm going to be talking more about Chile here and women in mining generally, not board, but women in mining generally. And the first that I would mention is an ideological barrier. So. And this is the fairness versus productivity discussion. And I've seen how women in mining this year, for example, is doing a very strong push on again proving that there's a very strong productivity dimension in this whole discussion. I'm a lawyer by trade, so I think fairness is very important by itself, but still it's very important to have both there. And again, I see there's a certain resistance still in certain quarters on the productivity. So the data, all data coming there will always be very, very powerful. Then Women in Mining Chile published a very interesting report in 2022 talking about some of the challenges of women in mining with data based. This is an empirical study, and they talk essentially about three. The first one is discrimination. The second is work family life balance, and the third, which I wanted to stop for a second, is sexual harassment. And you know that this risk in general in society is huge, is terrible. When you look at the data of sexual violence against women, is terrible. And because of the mining setting of sites and the male culture, I think this is a super important barrier. And there's still way to go in terms of awareness and changing the culture, the male culture at site. Again, knowing that the background risk in society is really high. Is really high. So that's what I've seen, and I want to recognize. I was at BHP when Rio Tinto did their everyday respect report. And I think that was really a bold and impressive step. So a company really sort of going to the center of the problem with boldness and braveness. So that's what I've seen in Chile, Vivienne.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm going to go to Monique next, but Chris, I'd love you to comment on that report as well. Monique.
Yeah, I mean, I think Santiago's touched on many of the things that I was going to say. I think, national cultures and some of the practices around, women in the home and caring responsibilities is a challenge in some of the markets that we operate in, and Santiago talks about Chile. We're also in Chile, and I think that is a practical thing that we have to address. We have had some good positive results in some of our Latin American countries. And I'll give you an example. In Peru, when we started up our new mine in Quellaveco, we made a specific effort to hire truck drivers from women in the community, and largely the whole population of truck drivers came from women who had previously worked in the home, so they weren't in paid employment. Many of them couldn't even drive cars, but we trained them, and we had a crew of truck drivers who actually had better fuel efficiency, tyre wear, productivity than others who had worked in some of our other locations. So I think it demonstrates it can be done, but you have to make some deliberate efforts to go where perhaps we haven't gone before, and find a way. We also need to take that example in some of our other countries, also in Latin America or Africa. The point that you also make, Santiago, about gender-based violence, GBV, I mean, I think that is something that exists across mining. And I think, particularly in underground mining, I think that is one of the risks that, when people feel that nobody's watching, it's been okay in the past to behave in a certain way. And, we're committed to zero tolerance on issues of GBV. We have our own Living with Dignity hub that we use to manage that. We work with employees, but we also work with anybody that's connected to our operations, also in communities, to train, tackle some of the root causes, and also provide support to victims and counselling to perpetrators. And I think that's one of the things that we do from a our sort of purpose perspective to demonstrate that we exercise responsible mining. And I think, you know, unless you're doing that, it is also difficult to tackle some of the things that you mentioned about national cultures and the role of women at home as caregivers, rather than, you know, women who are an economic strength for, you know, the workforce and for society. And that's about, you know, the responsibility of corporations in changing societal views, and I think that is something that's important for mining, also important for other sectors. And my other example about working in Denmark, I think Denmark is, you know, a Scandinavian country, and Scandinavia has been working on this for years, and so you do see a much more balanced society because of that, and obviously we're making up for lost time.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful insights. And what's interesting about the gender-based violence and harassment, it's not restricted to mining sectors or others. I mean, in the UK, we had two reports actually, and the most recent one was entitled "Sexism in the City," which talked about harassment and inappropriate behaviors that are still taking place, and that's basically in an office environment as well. So it's something that revisits us, and I think it's fantastic that you pulled out the piece around national cultures and basically our societal expectations. So what is our societal expectations and roles of men and women, and you know, what role does business play in terms of perhaps changing that, in some ways respecting it, but also providing opportunities. And can I just say how hugely impressed I am that you didn't see, you were able to see beyond the fact that these women didn't even know how to drive. And so rather than using that as a barrier, it was actually, well, then we'll teach them to drive. And guess what? They seem to be driving quite well, which is really impressive. So I think that's a real lesson in terms of, you know, where the skills aren't there, you can nonetheless develop those skills, which is absolutely super.
Again, it's about pipeline, Vivienne.
Yes. And role modeling. I think we've talked a little bit about role modeling already. And I think another sector, again, that does quite well on this is the produce area, where for some countries, it's usually been the man that goes, you know, to pick tea or whatever it is. And many companies are now looking to engage their wives. Bring your wife to work. There is also a job for her here. And then you end up with a dual income household. And then the organization gets involved in childcare and so on and so forth. So, you know, these lessons can be shared across different sectors, and it helps to just lift both the economic and the social benefit for everyone. Chris, could I come to you? Because obviously the Rio Tinto report has been referenced, and it would be great to get some of your perspectives on that.
Absolutely. Yes, so the first Everyday Respect report for Rio actually was commissioned in 2000. We had internally uncovered some real challenges with our culture and commissioned an independent report led by Liz Broderick, the ex-Equalities Minister in Australia. And we published that in 2022. And I'm sure many of you on the call have read it. It is truly shocking what that report uncovered. And we've been working on a long programme of recommendations, and we published our progress report in November last year as a follow-up. I think what's really interesting is, and that report looks at not just sexual harassment and sexual-based violence, but also bullying and racism. Now, in terms of our actually reporting data that came out in the second report, it's not really improved. And I think, you know, there's a couple of interesting pieces there as we've looked under that. One, I think the real focus we've had on increasing psychological safety has absolutely led to a much greater level of comfort in reporting issues. So I think what we're now all saying actually is, whilst that first report was shocking, it probably only told part of the story. But secondly, what it has really helped do is start to normalize the conversation about this. It's given license to be able to start talking about these sorts of behaviors, the prevalence of them and the impact they have. And Monique, I really resonated with the comment you made about that going wider than outside of our gates. It was really interesting in one of our quite remote sites when the first report was published, and we held sessions with all of our employees to talk through the findings. You know, we probably had men in the organization who said, I'm not sure that's true. I don't think that's really what it's like here, who then went home and went out into that community and said, you know, this is what the report's saying. It's not like that, is it? And they had wives and daughters who said, oh, yes, it is. And it's not just like that in the workplace. That happens to me every day of my life. And it has created in that society a really different focus, because again, it enabled that conversation that had never been enabled before. So I think it has had a great impact. The most recent report, overwhelmingly, we were seeing the perception in the organization are that things are improving and will continue to improve. So whilst I've said our reporting rates haven't improved, there is a perception that we are on a journey. But as you said around, you know, Scandinavia, etc., this is a many-year journey, changing culture at scale globally in an organization where your external culture can vary so hugely. You know, we would be minimizing this if we said, oh yeah, we'll be there in 3 years or 5 years. It's going to need many years. And I think what's been most key here is the bravery of both our exco and the board to publish not only the original reports publicly, but then the second report that, you know, there might have been, oh, well, if the numbers look good, we'll publish. Actually, they made the commitment before they'd seen the report. They made a public commitment that would also go publicly. So I think that bravery of our leadership to be totally transparent on that is one of the things that's really driving progress. And it's probably, you know, one of the areas that whenever we engage with investors, with shareholders, there's always a strong focus on this, and it's absolutely aligned to our values. And I think we had an interesting conversation just recently with the changes in the US about whether one of our metrics that is actually sits on our global scorecard and drives an element of our bonus payout, whether we should stick with that because it's a diversity element. And it was absolutely non-negotiable with our board and our exco that that's aligned to our values and we will not change.
Thank you. That's really powerful. We're going to talk a little bit about leadership later, but before we go there, I wanted to focus on accountability and metrics, actually. And Monique, obviously you've got an insight in terms of how the review works and so on and so forth, but it would be really helpful to hear from you how transparency and public reporting can influence and impact internal decision-making and cultural change. And I think we alluded to it a little bit earlier that, you know, being able to see that comparison is potentially a driver in that space. But if you'd like to tell us a little bit more.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, I think it's clear. I believe in the transparency, and I think it's a really important lever for change. You know, from a culture perspective, we're trying to drive leadership accountability, and that's not just for cost and production tons. That's about culture and everything that goes in it, which is, you know, also about ways of working, the environment that you create, and providing the right kind of conditions for everyone to thrive. And of course, gender is one aspect of that, but, you know, for us, it's more broad. It's about inclusion, and gender is the one metric that we're able to measure consistently around the world. You know, some of the other dimensions around, you know, race or sexual orientation or disability, you know, other dimensions are more difficult for us to measure. Mind you, that hasn't stopped us running a campaign internally to try and encourage all employees to volunteer to report their dimensions of diversity, so that our individual country markets can actually work within the possibility of what's possible to report locally and to drive, you know, the proper leadership accountability. And, you know, we had a long history in South Africa where, you know, the topic of race and reporting on race and the expectations from a country governance perspective around making progress to, you know, right historical wrongs is key to operating in that kind of environment. I think, you know, one of the other things about accountability, which I think needs to be talked about, is around, you know, how you link the pipeline and, you know, succession and capability development, the core bread and butter of the outputs of you know, other KPIs that you might measure. And if you can do a good job at sort of linking, you know, the employee life cycle to that, I think it actually makes it easier for leaders and all employees to play their role. So, you know, when you think about, you know, hiring, when you think about promotion, when you think about performance, you measure the people aspects of performance as well as, you know, other KPIs, you know, safety, production, cost, etc. But, you know, there's also things about, you know, pay equity. There's also things, employee surveys, incentives, you know, on Chris's point on incentives. We had a leadership conversation in our executive leadership team about what are we going to do on progressing inclusion and diversity the week after Trump's inauguration. And I thought it was going to be a really interesting discussion whether, you know, people who were not all in would use this as a way to kind of backtrack. I'm really pleased to be able to report that in our executive leadership team, we had a great conversation, said, you know, no, we're not backtracking, we're going to go further because this is really critical for us to be, you know, true to our purpose of being a responsible miner. And so we then actually added another incentive. So our long-term incentive is linked to our making progress in terms of gender representation. And we were, you know, talking about that in the context of culture. It's not the number that we're looking for, it's actually the actions that create the right kind of conditions so that you end up with, you know, gender representation and a more healthy pipeline for the future. So, you know, we're big believers in accountability and in reporting and having the right metrics alongside all the other metrics that we report on. It's critical, we think, to drive the right kind of leadership accountability.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And you raise an interesting couple of points there, particularly around gender. So gender is probably the only metric that we can measure consistently across all jurisdictions that doesn't have challenges with regard to local legislation or culture, as the case may be. Obviously, you know, inclusion is intersectional, and women, you know, can reflect all of that intersectionality in terms of diversity, but it is at least one consistent measure that we can have for half the population of the world, which is very helpful. And thank you very much for sharing that piece. Just in terms of, you know, the reaction post the election of President Trump, and what we're seeing is a very significant rollback in the US. We're also seeing a lot of companies and shareholders reacting and expressing their views in relation to some companies that have seen this as an opportunity to pull back. But it's great to also hear those other companies that have recognized that actually it's all the more important to lean in to this space. Chris, could I come to you on the topic of accountability and metrics? And are there any specific metrics that you use at Rio Tinto?
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. And similar to Monique, I think, you know, one of the things that we really look at is that.
Chris, your sound is going.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
So similar to Monique, one of the things we're really focused on is measurement within the pipeline. So are we building that sustainable pipeline? So as we think about the elements of the life cycle in terms of the proportion of women that we're attracting as candidates, that we're selecting, if we think about things like the proportion of women on our succession plans for key roles, and also then looking at representation at every level, but also by country and by job family, because we see that there are differences there. And so as we look at representation and we maybe average that out at a product group level, what are we missing about some of those pockets? And in fact, for our senior leaders, as we think about performance of senior leaders, we do look at gender representation within their organisation, within their teams, because we may see that a particular part of our business has representation at an acceptable average. But if we then look within that, we might see that different senior leaders actually have quite different representation, some of which may be, very explainable factors, but others may be indicators into the culture that we have within that part of the organisation. So I think looking much more deeply beyond the top line measure is one. And the second one is again, as Monique mentioned, looking at some of those cultural aspects and how do we look at the survey through different lenses. Again, where are we seeing a very different response for the women to the same question on the survey, but particularly also in exit surveys. So we've had some really interesting data as women leave the organisation about what are the drivers for voluntary leavers. So I think it's using all of the same elements, but really looking a little bit deeper to see where in the life cycle are we having disproportionate impacts on women or seeing disproportionate difference in representation.
Oh, that's really useful. And I think it aligns a lot with what Barbara was also saying in terms of the importance of disaggregated data. So just taking a survey or just taking a look across the board isn't good enough. It's actually really important to look into the data and to see what those differences are. And even across different sectors, we see different responses from men and women in the same role, in the same company. And that's actually really, really important. And then you can also see where issues may be arising. But Santiago, I think you've probably got some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, again, thinking of the country as a jurisdiction, and it's interesting to see that with this new bill that will become law in Chile soon is sort of doing, because as we discussed before, this public-private effort of putting targets and then having transparency and accountability creates a movement around the target that probably, if you move into hard quotas, you may lose part of that momentum in which you bring everyone into the effort. I don't know. It's a reflection, especially now that you're seeing these countercultural movements that can. For example, a law can be derogated, can be abrogated, and then you're back to nothing. So as opposed to really having targets that have full legitimacy and a lot of people working in terms of achieving it. So at least the good news is that this bill, as I understand it, it will have a first phase that will continue to work under this principle of complain or explain. It's not a hard quota. It's complain or explain. That again, I think builds more momentum and probably helps more the long term efforts.
Super. Yes, and that's a really good principle, that the comply or explain if you don't comply principle is very helpful. Now, just a quick message to everybody. We will have time for Q&A at the end, and I think Barbara's been very busy in the chat. So if you'd like to ask a question, please pop it in the chat and we will come to it. But there's a couple of more topics I want to touch on with our panelists before we get there. So you've got time to have a think about it. And the first one is really around the role of leadership and allies, because we touched on this a little bit earlier, and the importance of leadership both at the board level and leadership at the executive level, and also the role of allies. It's all very well doing it for yourself, but actually what's super important is to have those allies. So I wonder if I could come to each of you to talk about that. And Monique, can I start with you?
Yeah, please. Yeah, I mean, I think the pipeline and the talent development piece are critical, because as both Chris and Santiago have mentioned, you can focus on the leadership, and then you have a vacancy, you know, if there isn't the pipeline and the bench underneath, it's all for nothing. I think, you know, that goes hand in hand with leadership accountability. So, you know, talking to leaders and measuring leaders on what are they doing to create and develop their own successes and other successes for the company. You know, there are certain disciplines where pipelines might be weaker. So, you know, for us, it's some of the technical or operational disciplines where, you know, we have more progress to make, and not the functional areas where we've got plenty of women, for example. You know, one thing that I would like to add here on the sort of pipeline and talent development topic is, Vivienne, you're familiar with Iris and Siri and this book, Make Work Fair. I was first introduced to them because of the FTSE Women Leaders work, and we had Iris and Siri come and run a webinar for Anglo-American leaders yesterday. We'll talk about this notion of make work fair, and there are some principles in there about, you know, what you can do to, you know, deal with systemic issues, and, you know, some of it's about counting, some of it's about, you know, making sure that your processes and practices are fair all throughout the sort of employee life cycle. And they raise an important point in their work about, you know, one of the barriers for gender balance in some of the decisions that are made about talent development or pipeline is this notion of, well, the women have got thin files. What's that all about? And they use an example in legal practice about, you know, how many clients and how many hours of experience on certain types of, you know, legal cases that women have versus men. And they did a study in a big legal company in the US. And they talked about the practical issues of you know, women not having the experience, and that's what they call the thin file. And that's because the way that cases were allocated and experiences were allocated in legal firms, partners chose who they would have working on their you know, specific cases or clients or whatever. You know, the study demonstrates that the issue with that is partners are choosing people that look like them, you know, went to the same law school, you know the same people, mix in the same circles, all of those sorts of things that we know exist in the world. And then they made a practice where they said, well, that's not how we're going to distribute work in this firm anymore. We're going to make sure that people take turns in distributing the work, and it's fair across the genders and across the ethnicities and so on and so forth. And they've tackled it that way. So my point here is, we in Anglo-American and probably everywhere need to look at some of the ways that talent is progressed and developed and, you know, is visible in companies, to think about how we create the fairness to avoid that we fall into the same traps. And for us, it's, you know, the visibility thing is, we as the leadership of this company need to get out and we need to know who we've got, and it shouldn't be the ones that automatically get the opportunities because they happen to be in the right geographical location or at the right meeting or know the right person. We need to go and find those people and make sure that everybody gets the right kind of opportunities. But also, we're clear on what are the criteria, and we're visible, publishing what that criteria is, so that anybody who's interested in progressing understands what are the critical experiences and how to get those. And in that way, we kind of deal with some of the issues from a pipeline and talent development perspective that have existed in this company and probably in others, you know, for a long time.
Super, thank you. And I think you probably answered one of the questions in the chat, which is, you know, how do companies address the issue of female promotions at B and C levels? And you've been clear that every company has an average percentage of turnover a year. In order to be intentional and effective in your strategy for a more inclusive environment, you need to have built those pipelines. You can't suddenly be confronted with, oh, we need to fill this role. And then it's like, but I need to do it urgently. And so you forget everything that you've been espousing and you just go for the quick fix solution, whatever happens to be close at hand, as opposed to making a deliberate and a strategic selection. And so the importance of those pipelines cannot be underestimated, and that focus on, what does your talent bench look like? Who's ready to move into what? And I love your analogy of the thin file. Santiago is a lawyer in his past, and I'm a lawyer as well, so the thin file resonates. And it is really about the experience piece as well. I've got one question in the chat about CEOs, but I'm going to come back to that one in a minute, because I do want to just focus on the role of leadership and allies. And Santiago, can I come to you? Because obviously you're an incredible role model as a male CEO of a mine company who is focused on inclusion. You've got experience of both large and junior mining companies. Can you talk to us a little bit about how essential that leadership and ally piece is?
Yeah, and here I want to return to my experience at BHP, and I work at BHP at the previous decade, which is a decade of, let's call it the decade of learning. So I don't want to be unfair, because it's a previous time. But first, I want to highlight the importance of female leadership. What I saw during that decade is that the work done by very strong female leaders was absolutely fundamental. And so again, it's just another encouragement for all the women to step up and to exert that leadership, because it can really change the reality. And what we're seeing today is probably in many of your numbers, Vivienne, is probably the work of a group of very strong female leaders in all the organizations. That's what I assume from my experience at BHP. On the male side, last decade, so I would say, in terms of first, and I think it is still there in one of the questions, is a lack of awareness. And I want to go back to this risk of sexual harassment. And first is we do not fully realize the size of this background risk. In the US, that have good statistics, is one in 4 or 1 in 5 women have suffered severe sexual violence. I'm talking about rape or attempt of rape or something like that. So the background statistic, the background risk in society is just huge, and we don't have full awareness of that. I don't know why, but we continue not to have full awareness of that. And second is that in mining, the experience of the site is what some sociologists call totalizing. The word's in Spanish, I don't know the word in English, but this idea is like in the army or in the church or in schools, is that you are the full day, 24 hours there. So that experience is very intense. And the combination of those two things is quite difficult to address, and again go back to this lack of awareness. And the third thing I want to mention is that apart from the accountability and transparency that we're talking about, the numbers and targets, there's another very important dimension, which is scarce decisions. Is when companies and organizations make scarce decisions, like who to hire or who to fire, who to discipline, and really the powerfulness of how companies speak at those moments. And I'm not sure organizations are fully there yet on that aspect.
Thank you. And you're absolutely spot on to continue that focus in terms of the underlying societal issues and realities that we need to continue to take into consideration. And you're right, a lot of it is that it's a lack of awareness. Often people don't know what they don't know. And actually, if you put it into that broader societal context of, what is a woman's experience across her life and in her different roles, actually, it really does change the discussion enormously. So thank you very much for focusing on that. Chris, could I ask you a little bit about the leadership and allies and the role of leaders? Certainly my experience has been that, it's very difficult to get change in an organization unless the CEO and that senior leader actually believes it. Because if they don't believe it, what they do is they just give it to somebody else to sort out, and it doesn't really happen. It's not that difficult for everyone to figure out whether the organization actually buys into it or not. So can you talk to us a little bit about that leadership and allies piece? You're on mute, I think.
No. Okay.
No, you're perfect.
Okay. So I think for me, it's the behavior. So, as a people function, we can produce all of the data, but when a senior leader, meets with a team, goes to an event, whatever, what they don't comment on or what they accept is actually then what becomes normal in the organization. So if they don't, when they go into the room, say, why are there no women here? Why are there no women on your succession plan? If they're not asking the question, if they're not making the challenge, actually all the data we can produce, all the programs we can run will make no difference at all. It's, I think, that real leadership commitment to challenge and ask the question and make it actually, this is a real part of our leadership. It's not an administrative process. And where we've seen some of the biggest impact is, to Monique's point, on the formal programs, we can manage a bit. It's what happens day to day. If the women aren't getting the experiences in the job, if they're not getting put onto the projects, if they're not getting the stretch experience in the role, and if a leader doesn't question that, if a leader is accepting that, then that just becomes the norm. So I think, leaders absolutely challenging the behavior, challenging the outcome in the moment is key. I think the other thing, though, is about leaders being brave and making a longer term commitment. So, for example, in our iron ore business in Western Australia, we are really challenged with representation of women in our operational roles on the front line. And that there is a finite pool. So actually what the senior team did there was actually set up and focus both money, but also importantly, headcount to create a new to mining program. So women with transferable skills were brought onto a new to mining program, didn't initially go into a job because they didn't have the skills. And they were in a sort of capability building program for, depending on the area, 6 months. So it was additional headcount, it was overhead count that enabled us to bring those women in and give them the experience and the skills to set them up for success before they were deployed to teams. Because had we deployed them straight in, they would, their credibility in the team would have been impacted, their ability to be effective and demonstrate the difference they could make would be impacted. So actually that thoughtfulness of and only the most senior leadership team could actually sanction that and say, yes, we will make over a number of years a significant contribution in terms of both money to do the capability build and reserve headcount to enable us to start to bring those women in. Because otherwise, we would have been just down to trying to poach women from other mining companies, and actually that's a lose-lose for everyone. So how do we actually increase the pool of women there? And that took a really big leadership commitment.
Thank you. That's amazing. I'm so impressed by the range of initiatives. So, not taking the fact that women don't have a driving license as the answer and actually training them. And then the new to mining initiative, I think, is absolutely extraordinary. Now, I'm sorry to say that we really only have about 5 minutes left. And so I'm going to have to compress some of our final questions. And I think we've answered some of those in the chat already. But my final one is let's look ahead. And there's two parts of this. The first one is just in relation to the CEO question. What is it? If you had the power, how would you solve the lack of female CEOs? And that's like your one sentence in mining. And then the broader one that I just want you to focus on, and just a minute or two each, is what advice would you give to mining companies just beginning this journey, or those struggling to make meaningful impact based on the experience that you've had in this space? So could I start with Monique and then Santiago and then Chris?
Yeah, sure. So I think a couple of things. This is not an HR responsibility. This is a leadership responsibility. And this requires leaders to stand up and step up, and be clear on what the objective is, and have the reporting, transparency, measurement the same as you would have on any other business metric. And that requires proper performance management and consequential management. So let's evaluate the performance holistically, and if this area isn't shaping up, then it should be no different from any of the other metrics that leaders are managed on. And then the other part is, if all mining companies focus on the pipeline, then there will be more capability for everyone, and that's a win-win for everyone. So I think if we do that, and we address some of the more systemic issues around building the capability pipeline, that's when we're going to see real progress here in a sustainable way.
Thank you. And I think it's an excellent point. Actually, we all need to be working together on this rather than 1 or 2 or 3 companies leading. It's actually in all of our best interests, because we create that community of talent that we will all benefit from at the end of the day. So thank you. That was fantastic. Santiago, can I come to you? And I don't mind whether you take this from a mining perspective or a Chilean perspective.
No, I agree with Monique. It's a pipeline. It's a pipeline. Probably that's the main driver for this. It's a pipeline, and probably that's the next big challenge. And given the amazing work done in the last 10 years, maybe that pipeline would be better positioned. But if you allow me, I want to mention something, another and completely different dimension. I don't want to say goodbye without mentioning this. I work in a project. We're a greenfield project, and one of the most interesting discussions with communities about bringing a new project where there's nothing there is that there's still this concern in stakeholders in the community that when you bring a mining project, you will have, I don't know, 2,000 men that will come to this community and will depredate everything. That's sort of many times let's say the background prejudice that they have with mining. And when you say no, today we're talking about a mining industry which is balanced 50-50. It's a family proposition. It's not anymore this idea, and again, this is sort of barbarians will come into town and will depredate everything. So there are there are even more spillover effects. And again, I have that conversation, let's say, every day at the community, explaining why it is a completely different experience having a mining neighbor today that it was, again, 20 or 30 years ago.
That's actually an excellent point to make, and thank you so much. And the only reason it's become a family proposition is through the leadership of some incredible firms that are recognizing all the problems that the historical way of working has delivered, and actually the way forward is going to benefit everyone. I think that's a really important piece, particularly as we experience a lot of ED&I backlash, is actually what's good for women is also very good for men. Chris, I'm going to give you the final word before we wrap up.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think for me, there's a big piece around really our thinking about what does a CEO look like, and particularly what experience must they have had? Because I think we often start with and actually we hear this from investors as well, there is a very fixed view of what a CEO in a mining company needs to have done. And I think as the whole sector, transforms more with, a much greater focus on technology, I think we can be more open there. Because if we're saying that we need somebody who's been in a leadership role in mining for 30 years, we're going to get another man. So I think there is something there about being a little bit more open and really being focused on the skills, the capabilities, and they may have been gained in other sectors or in other ways. And I think also being more open to the fact that women's careers may look slightly different in terms of their trajectory. They may have not come the normal route. They may have stepped in and out of roles because of different priorities at different times in their life. So I think being more open-minded as we almost write that candidate spec for a CEO, but also trying to influence our shareholders to be more open-minded too, because very often there is a strong pressure from the outside to bring in a particular focus there. So I think the more open we can be around what does not, and it's not just for CEOs, I think this is for all leadership roles, around what are the skills and experiences we need, as opposed to what does the traditional background of a leader in that role look like, will really help us consider a wider pool for all senior leadership roles.
Super. Thank you so very much. And you're absolutely right. It isn't just what happens within the business. It's that broader ecosystem, including the shareholders and the investors, and in many instances, the regulators, because they often set the expectations for those senior leadership roles. And in a sense, they ring fence who that talent pool might possibly be and keep it narrow without actually opening it up. So I'm so sorry, but we do have to bring this to a close. And I would usually do my full wrap up of thoughts, because as you can see, I've been taking lots and lots of notes while we've been speaking, but we don't have time for that, unfortunately. But I do have 3 things to say. The first one is to say thank you so much to Monique, to Santiago, and to Chris for sharing your insights, your experience from your firms and from your careers with us today. That's been absolutely fantastic. A huge thank you to Barbara and IWM for collaborating on this initiative today, and for your teams for setting it up. A big thank you to all of the participants. I have loved all of your comments and questions in the chat, which is absolutely super. And don't worry if you missed part of the beginning. I'm so sorry about the hiccup with regard to the Zoom link, because the whole thing has been recorded. So Barbara, in all of her efficiency at IWM, will be sharing the recording so you can actually watch it again, and also share it with your colleagues, because we've had some interesting comments in there about who else could have been on this call, who should be seeing the data and hearing these insights, because they're the ones who really need to understand what's going on here. So thank you very much, everyone, for an absolutely fantastic event. It's been super to see so many people from so many different countries across the world joining in. And I hope you've had a fabulous International Women's Day in Mining and a week. So thank you. I've learned an awful lot. I hope you have done as well. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.